It is 3 in the morning inside a requisitioned French château during the opening hours of the Ardennes offensive, where 30 colonels and majors stand around a long oak table covered in tactical overlays. Near the drafty back corner stands Corporal Daniel Kovacs, a 22-year-old draftsman with black map ink staining his fingers, feeling the hard shape of a small tin ring box tucked into his wool trousers pocket. He slowly raises his right hand into the thick cigar smoke. The entire room goes dead quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Damn pens stop mid-stroke over the acetate. A colonel from Third Army Operations lowers his chin, staring at the corporal with absolute disbelief, while a major beside him slowly lets his hands drop to his sides, calculating the immediate disaster of a clerk speaking out of turn. Kovacs clears his throat softly in the freezing air. "Sir, I think the map is wrong." At the head of the table, General George S. Patton, Jr. does not flinch. He slowly turns his head, his hands rested flat against the edge of the drafting board, his eyes locking onto the young corporal without making a sound. What happened in the next 60 seconds would determine the movement of an entire army along the snow-choked roads toward Bastogne, and the answer was not what anyone in that room was prepared for. If you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to bring these forgotten moments of human drama and battlefield history to life every week. Let me back up a second, because to understand what it cost Corporal Daniel Kovacs to raise his hand in that room, you need to understand what the Third Army briefing room actually was during the winter of 1944. It was not a quiet classroom or a thoughtful planning semicet. It was a pressure cooker set inside an unheated 18th-century château, where drafty windows rattled against the freezing night air and cigarette smoke hung in heavy gray curtains beneath crystal chandeliers. On December 19, 1944, the German army had smashed through the Ardennes forest, cutting off the 101st Airborne at Bastogne and threatening to split the Allied line in two. General Patton had promised High Command that Third Army could pivot 90 degrees in freezing mud and attack north within 72 hours. That meant hundreds of tanks, thousands of supply trucks, and tens of thousands of men had to move down narrow, icy French roads on a timetable measured in minutes. Every officer in that chateau was operating on pure adrenaline and zero sleep, staring down a crisis that could define the entire war in Western Europe. In a space like that, military hierarchy is not just a habit. It is an absolute law. Senior officers spent decades climbing to those seats around the briefing table. Map overlays were drafted by specialized sections, vetted by majors, approved by colonels, and presented to 3-star generals as finished operational truth. An enlisted clerk like a 22-year-old corporal was expected to be invisible. His job was to carry tracing paper, sharpen grease pencils, sweep the floor, and keep his mouth shut. To speak out of turn in front of 30 field-grade officers was an unpardonable breach of protocol. To interrupt a briefing to tell the commanding general that his primary advance axis was flawed was social and professional suicide. Every junior officer in that room saw the error or felt the tension, but they calculated the personal cost of speaking up against the safety of remaining silent. Because here was the cold arithmetic of armored movement. A single blocked bridge on an advance route meant a column 4 miles long grinding to a sudden halt on a 2-lane road in the dark. It meant hundreds of idling Sherman tanks burning gallons of precious fuel while sitting as stationary targets for enemy artillery. An army moving north to relieve a besieged town cannot afford a 3-hour detour caused by a destroyed crossing that nobody factored into the schedule. That lost time is measured not in administrative delays, but in destroyed vehicles and dead infantrymen waiting for help that did not arrive on time. The math of war allows zero room for bad data on a route overlay. And that was the room Daniel Kovacs raised his hand in. Picture the scene. 30 officers in high-collared wool uniforms packed into a grand salon, their breath misting in the unheated air. Crystal chandeliers swayed gently in the cold drafts sweeping through shuttered French doors, the smell of wet wool, stale field coffee, and cheap cigar smoke mixed with the sharp chemical tang of map ink and acetate. On the long oak table, blue desk lamps illuminated the thick tactical overlay, its grease-pencil lines cutting across northern France toward Bastogne. In the back, Corporal Daniel Kovacs stood frozen, his fingers stained dark with drawing ink, his thumb unconsciously pressing against the small tin ring box in his pocket, Every officer around that table was running the same internal calculation. The operations majors knew the mapping section had rushed the route overlays, using whatever old French cartography they could scrape together. A few of them had likely harbored their own quiet doubts about those river crossings. But not one had dared to speak up in front of the commanding general. They watched Kovacs with a mix of shock and dread, waiting for the wrath of three-star leadership to fall on an enlisted clerk. Beside him, the map section sergeant stared straight ahead, rigid as a fence post, calculating the immediate collapse of the boy's military career. Stay with me, because what happened next in that room is the part nobody was expecting. The accounts that survive from that early morning inside the château are remarkably consistent in shape. Nobody remembered a raised voice, a slammed fist, or a harsh reprimand. They remembered the dry creak of floorboards as Patton slowly moved toward the long oak drafting table. The three-star general bent over the bottom corner of the heavy paper, pulling the transparent acetate back with two calloused fingers. He did not glare at the young corporal standing in the smoke, not the way a commander looks at an insolent clerk, not the way a general looks at an inconvenient interruption. He looked at the cartographic date stamp printed in the margin the exact way a civil engineer reads a blueprint. His thumb brushed over the faded ink mark reading 1930. Patton stood up straight, adjusted his leather belt, and looked down at the blue route line cutting toward the river valley. He picked up a red wax grease pencil, struck a firm cross through the bridge mark, and quietly spoke two words. He's right. The room remained completely suspended in cold air. The operations colonel who had been leading the movement briefing froze with his wooden pointer hovering above the board, unable to finish his sentence. Patton did not wait for an explanation or an apology from his staff. He reached across the table for the secondary reconnaissance overlays, pulled a fresh route pencil from the tray, and began redrawing the Third Army's main advance axis 7 miles west toward an intact operational railway trestle. The tactical shift was immediate, precise, and executed without another word. Sergeant First Class Roy Ingle, watching from the doorway with a stack of map cases tucked under his arm, later described the general's reaction with a single word: deliberate. See, what most folks don't realize is that military hierarchy in wartime usually defends its own decisions at almost any cost. In a high-pressure headquarters, rank often demands that an operational plan be treated as correct simply because of the rank of the officer who signed off on it. But Patton understood a fundamental truth about tactical arithmetic that many senior staff officers overlooked. Personal pride does not carry 30-ton Sherman tanks across a concrete bridge that was blown up 6 years earlier. A gold leaf on a collar cannot rebuild a river crossing or turn a destroyed bridge deck into a usable roadway. The arithmetic of armored movement is cold, brutal, and completely indifferent to human vanity. When an advance column grinds to a halt because of bad intelligence, the operational cost is calculated instantly in wasted hours, burned fuel, and trapped soldiers exposed to artillery. By accepting a corporal's correction on an obscure map date, Patton was not trying to be modest or kind. He was acting with pure, cold-blooded operational practicality. He valued physical ground truth over staff pride, because on a rapidly moving front, bad data is far more dangerous than an enemy counterattack. A commander who ignores a fact because a lower-ranking man found it is a commander who courts disaster. Patton looked at the date because the date was the only thing that was real. Every officer who served under General George S. Patton, Jr. during the European campaign understood that the Third Army operated at a tempo unmatched by any other command. Decisions that would take days in rear echelon headquarters were executed in minutes along the forward line, driven by Patton's belief that speed, audacity, and relentless pressure were the ultimate life-saving tools on a battlefield. Yet this relentless drive was balanced by an unyielding respect for practical competence on the ground, proving time and again that a commander who listens to physical ground truth is a commander who achieves decisive victory. Corporal Daniel Kovacs was 22 years old, born and raised on the south side of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His father spent 34 years leaning over a wooden drafting table in a Jones and Laughlin steel mill, checking stress tolerances on heavy structural I-beams with a sharp lead pencil and a magnifying lens. From the time Kovacs was 14 years old, his father taught him that a single misread fraction on a drafting sheet meant 30 tons of molten metal poured into the wrong mold, At 18, Kovacs enrolled in civil surveying classes at the Second Avenue Trade School, learning to measure slope angles along industrial railroad tracks, and read the small cartographic notes in the bottom margins of property surveys. Before shipping out overseas to join the Third Army, he spent $30 of his pay to buy a small tin ring box containing an engagement ring bought from another soldier, intending to give it to a girl named Clara, who worked behind the glove counter at a downtown Pittsburgh department store. His plan for after the war was simple and quiet. Take a civil technician job with the county surveying department, buy a small brick house in the hills, and build a peaceful life. He was not a romantic hero. He was the kind of man who looked at a line on paper and saw the physical ground beneath it. He was the kind of man who understood that numbers on a blueprint do not bend for anyone. When Sergeant First Class Roy Ingle walked into the map section tent 5 hours later, holding the official promotion paperwork bearing Patton's sharp, dark signature, Kovacs did not cheer or celebrate his advancement. He was sitting on an inverted wooden supply crate in the cold, rubbing his ink-stained fingers together to keep them warm, while carefully sharpening his grease pencils with a pocket knife. He looked down at the signed sergeant stripes on the document, glanced back at the fresh route tracing overlay drying on his drafting table, and simply asked Ingle if the convoy officers in the forward motor pool had already received the updated grid coordinates for the railway trestle. He did not care about the extra rank, the pay increase, or the sudden recognition from headquarters. He cared whether the trucks were heading toward open ground. Sergeant First Class Roy Ingle was 31 years old, from Altoona, Pennsylvania, a veteran map section NCO, who had spent 8 years working track dispatch for the Pennsylvania Railroad before the draft brought him into the Third Army staff. Ingle watched Kovacs sign the promotion sheet, handed him the fresh pair of wool chevrons, and went right back to sorting tactical grid sheets in the freezing draft. Ingle survived the brutal winter campaign in the Ardennes, crossed the Rhine River into Germany 6 months later, and returned home to his old job at the Altoona rail yards after the final surrender. Until he passed away in 1989, he kept an original blueprint carbon copy of that altered Third Army route overlay tucked inside his personal desk drawer, telling his sons that the entire relief column turned on a 22-year-old draftsman from Pittsburgh, who knew how to read a cartographic date stamp in the corner of a map. Was Patton right to accept a junior corporal's correction in front of his entire senior staff? Some would say that allowing an enlisted clerk to speak out of turn during a 3-star operational briefing undermines the fundamental chain of command. In a high-stakes war where authority must remain absolute, publicly listening to a low-ranking draftsman in front of 30 colonels risks setting a dangerous precedent that could erode rigid military discipline when immediate obedience is required. Others would say exactly the opposite. They would argue that real leadership requires prioritizing cold physical ground truth over professional ego, and that a commander who values staff hierarchy above a cartographic date stamp is a commander who invites needless disaster on the battlefield. Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.